A gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Oklahoma Territory, 1886, as Catherine Keller stood at her husband's grave, her tears mixing with the dry earth beneath her feet. Fort Smith was supposed to be their new beginning, a place where the dreams they'd crafted together in whispered promises would finally take root. Instead, she found herself alone, a widow at 26, with only the lingering scent of Thomas's cologne on his pillow to remind her he had ever existed at all. Catherine pulled her black shawl tighter around her shoulders as the last of the mourners departed. 3 weeks had passed since a band of outlaws had raided their small homestead on the outskirts of Fort Smith. Thomas had fought bravely, but a single bullet had stolen him away forever. Now, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, she felt more alone than she ever had before. "Mrs. Keller," Sheriff Wilson's voice cut through her thoughts, "I don't think it's wise for you to stay out here after dark. Let me escort you home." "I can manage, Sheriff," Catherine replied, her voice barely audible above the prairie wind. "I just need a few more minutes." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "Those men who killed your husband are still out there. I've sent telegrams to neighboring towns, but until they're caught, you ought to be careful." After the sheriff left, Catherine sank to her knees beside the fresh grave. "Thomas," she whispered, "how am I supposed to do this without you? I can't even breathe without you here." "Madam," a deep voice called from behind her. "Cemetery's not safe after sundown." Catherine turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. As he stepped closer, she could make out his features' weathered skin, sharp blue eyes, and a jawline partially hidden beneath several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were dusty from the trail, and a worn leather holster hung at his hip. "I don't need another reminder about safety, sir," Catherine said, hastily wiping away tears. The sheriff already expressed his concerns. The stranger removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Forgive my intrusion, madam. I'm Mason James. Just rode into town and was paying respects to my own kin when I noticed you here alone." Catherine stood, brushing dirt from her black dress. "Catherine Keller, and was my husband, Thomas." Mason nodded respectfully toward the grave. "Recently, 3 weeks ago, outlaws." She couldn't bring herself to elaborate further. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Keller." Catherine turned to leave, but her legs betrayed her. The weight of grief, coupled with days of barely eating, caused her to sway. Mason moved quickly, catching her arm before she could fall. "Easy now," he said softly. "When's the last time you ate something proper?" Catherine couldn't remember. Food had lost all taste since Thomas died. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her pallor suggested otherwise. "With respect, madam, you're not. Let me walk you home at least." Catherine wanted to refuse, but exhaustion overrode her pride. "My place is on the edge of town. It's the small homestead with the blue door." As they walked through the quieting streets of Fort Smith, Catherine felt the curious eyes of townsfolk upon them. A widow walking with a stranger would certainly fuel gossip by morning, but in that moment she couldn't summon the energy to care. "You're new to town," she observed, breaking the silence between them. Mason nodded. "Just passing through, or so I thought. Got word my uncle passed, left me a small parcel of land north of here." "I'm sorry about your uncle." "Don't be. Never met the man. My pa and him had a falling out years before I was born." Mason adjusted his hat. "Figured I'd see what the land was worth, then move on." They reached Catherine's modest home just as the last light faded from the sky. The small house Thomas had built with his own hands stood dark and silent, a reminder of all she had lost. "Thank you, Mr. James," Catherine said, reaching for her door. Mason hesitated. "Mrs. Keller, forgive me for being forward, but you shouldn't be alone tonight, not in your condition. I could make camp on your porch just to ensure your safety." Catherine stiffened. "That's very kind, but unnecessary. I've managed these past weeks alone." "The men who killed your husband, they've been caught." "No," she admitted. "Sheriff Wilson is still searching." "Then it ain't safe. I won't intrude, just keep watch from the porch. At first light, I'll be gone." Catherine wanted to refuse, but the memory of the night Thomas died, the sound of breaking glass, shouts, gunfire was still too raw. "The barn," she said finally. "There's clean hay and it would be more comfortable than the porch." Mason nodded. "Much obliged, madam." Catherine watched him walk toward the barn, his tall figure soon swallowed by darkness. She wasn't sure why she trusted this stranger, but something about his quiet strength reminded her of Thomas. Perhaps it was foolish, but tonight she was grateful not to be entirely alone. Inside her empty house, Catherine moved mechanically through her evening routine. She lit a lamp, put water on to boil, and tried to force down some bread and cheese, knowing she needed to keep up her strength. But each bite tasted like ash, and eventually she abandoned the effort. She changed into her nightgown and sat at her small vanity, brushing her long auburn hair. In the mirror's reflection, she saw the ghost of the woman she'd been just a month ago, vibrant, hopeful, loved. Now her green eyes were dull, her face gaunt with grief. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room, as if Thomas might somehow hear her. "I don't know how to be in this world without you." Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, with Catherine waking repeatedly to phantom sounds. Each time she would rise and check that her door remained securely bolted. Once, in the darkest hour before dawn, she peered through the curtains toward the barn. A small light flickered there, Mason keeping watch. As promised, morning arrived with golden light streaming through her windows. Catherine dressed in her widow's black, the fabric heavy and suffocating in the growing heat. When she stepped outside, she found Mason by the water pump washing his face. "Morning, Mrs. Keller," he said, straightening. Water dripped from his strong jawline and his hair was damp at the temples. "Hope I didn't disturb your rest." "Not at all," Catherine replied. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. James, but as you can see, I survived the night. I'm sure you have business in town to attend to." Mason dried his face with a handkerchief. "Actually, I was hoping I might offer my services around your place before I head out. Noticed your fence has some posts that need reinforcing, and that barn door is hanging by a thread." Catherine's instinct was to refuse. Thomas had always handled repairs, and accepting help from a stranger felt like another admission that her husband was truly gone. But practical considerations won out. The fence did need fixing, and she couldn't do it herself. "I can pay you a fair wage," she said finally. "No need for payment." "Consider it thanks for the barn shelter." His blue eyes held her steadily. "Unless you're uncomfortable with me staying a bit longer," Catherine hesitated. "A few repairs would be helpful," she admitted, "but I insist on providing meals in exchange for your labor." They settled into an uneasy arrangement. Mason worked on the fence while Catherine tended to her small garden and prepared a simple midday meal. They ate in stilted silence on the porch, the summer heat making conversations seem like too much effort. "Your husband," Mason said finally, setting aside his empty plate. "He was a farmer," Catherine nodded, "and a carpenter. We came west 3 years ago from Missouri. Thomas had dreams of building a bigger place eventually, raising horses." Her voice caught. "He never got the chance." "What will you do now?" Mason asked gently. Catherine had asked herself the same question countless times in the lonely darkness. "I don't know," she admitted. "My parents are gone. I have a sister in St. Louis, but—" She trailed off, unwilling to explain that her sister's husband had made improper advances before she and Thomas left Missouri. "No other family nearby." "No, Thomas was all I had." Catherine fought back fresh tears. "Sheriff Wilson suggested I might sell the place, return east where it's safer for a woman alone. But this was our dream. Selling feels like—" She couldn't finish the thought. Mason was quiet for a long moment. "My uncle's land, I haven't seen it yet, but the lawyer said it borders yours to the north. Might be I could help out here while I sort out my own affairs, just until you decide what you want to do." Catherine studied him suspiciously. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said simply. "And I know these parts can be dangerous for those on their own." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Sheriff Wilson rode up to the fence line, his expression grim beneath his mustache. "Mrs. Keller," he called, then noticed Mason. His hand instinctively moved closer to his sidearm. "Who's this?" "Mason James," Catherine replied. "He's been kind enough to help with some repairs." The sheriff dismounted, eyeing Mason warily. "James." "Any relation to Samuel James, who owned the north property?" "My uncle," Mason confirmed. "Never met him, but he left me his land." Sheriff Wilson relaxed slightly. Well, that explains it. Samuel was a good man, kept to himself mostly. Sorry for your loss. He turned to Catherine. Mrs. Keller, I've got word from Tulsa. They think they've identified one of the men who attacked your place. Fellow named Creed Hayes, known associate of the Dalton gang. Catherine's heart raced. Have they caught him? Not yet, but they're closing in. The sheriff glanced at Mason again. You planning to stay in these parts, Mr. James? Mason nodded. For a while at least. Need to see what my uncle's land is worth. Well, keep an eye out. These outlaws might circle back if they think Mrs. Keller can identify them. The sheriff tipped his hat to Catherine. I'll stop by again when I have more news. After the sheriff departed, a heavy silence fell between them. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the heat. You shouldn't stay here, Mason said quietly. Not until they catch these men. Where would I go? Catherine challenged. This is my home. I won't be driven from it by fear. Then I'm staying too, Mason declared. At least until the sheriff brings word they've been caught. Catherine wanted to argue but found herself oddly comforted by his resolve. The barn isn't suitable for long-term lodging. I've slept in worse, Mason assured her with a hint of a smile. Don't worry about me, Mrs. Keller. Days stretched into a week and a tentative routine emerged. Mason worked on repairs around Catherine's property during the day and retreated to the barn at night. Catherine found herself cooking proper meals again, if only to ensure her unexpected guest was fed. They rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, but his presence somehow made the crushing weight of grief more bearable. One evening, as Catherine was preparing supper, Mason appeared at the kitchen door with a bundle of fresh caught fish. Thought these might make a nice change from beans, he said, holding up his catch. Catherine smiled despite herself. I haven't had fresh fish since Thomas. She stopped, the familiar pain welling up. Thank you, I'll prepare them. Mason hesitated in the doorway. I could clean them for you. My mother taught me how. They worked side by side in companionable silence, Mason scaling and gutting the fish while Catherine prepared cornbread. It felt strangely domestic, and Catherine found herself stealing glances at his strong, capable hands. Tell me about your husband, Mason said suddenly, without looking up from his task. The request startled her. Most people avoided mentioning Thomas, as if speaking his name might somehow cause Catherine more pain than the constant ache of his absence. Thomas was kind, she began hesitantly. Patient, he could build anything with his hands. When we first met, he crafted a music box for my birthday, even though we barely knew each other, said he heard me humming that tune at church. The memory brought a small smile to her lips. He wasn't perfect. Stubborn as a mule when he thought he was right, but he was mine. Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sounds like a good man. He was, the best I've ever known. Catherine wiped her hands on her apron. What about you? You've never mentioned a wife. Never married, Mason admitted. Came close once, but she decided a cowhand's life wasn't steady enough. She married a banker instead. There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. And your family, Catherine pressed, realizing how little she knew about this man who'd become a fixture in her daily life. Lost my parents to influenza when I was 17. Been on my own since, working cattle drives mostly. Mason finished cleaning the last fish. This uncle's land is the first real property I've ever had claim to. Catherine found herself wondering what his land was like, whether it truly bordered hers as he'd claimed. Have you visited it yet? Rode out yesterday while you were in town. It's good land. Small cabin needs work, but the well is sound, about 30 acres in all. You could make a life there, Catherine observed. The thought brought an unexpected twinge of something like disappointment. Maybe, Mason replied noncommittally. Never thought of myself as the settling type. They ate supper on the porch that evening, watching fireflies emerge as darkness fell. The fish was delicious, and Catherine realized she'd eaten with actual appetite for the first time in weeks. Mrs. Keller, Mason began, setting aside his empty plate. Catherine, if I may. He waited for her nod before continuing. I've been thinking about your situation. You mentioned not wanting to sell, but managing this place alone won't be easy. Catherine tensed. I'm stronger than I look. No doubt, but even the strongest need help sometimes. Mason seemed to choose his next words carefully. What if we considered a business arrangement? I've got land but limited farming experience. You have knowledge but need protection and help with the physical labor. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. James? Catherine asked warily. A partnership of sorts. I help work your land, you advise me on mine, we share resources, equipment. Nothing improper, just two neighbors helping each other survive. Catherine studied him in the fading light. The idea had practical merit she couldn't manage alone indefinitely, and selling felt like abandoning Thomas's memory. Still, the arrangement Mason suggested would raise eyebrows in town. People would talk, she said finally. Mason shrugged. People always talk. Question is, does their talk matter more than your survival? Catherine had no immediate answer, and Mason didn't press for one. They finished their evening in silence, Mason returning to the barn while Catherine retired to her empty house. That night, she found herself turning his proposal over in her mind, weighing practicality against propriety. By morning, she still hadn't decided. The decision, however, was abruptly made for her when she awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Catherine bolted upright in bed, heart pounding as she heard heavy footsteps in her front room. Grabbing Thomas's old revolver from the nightstand, she crept toward her bedroom door. "Where's the woman?" a gruff voice demanded. "Check the bedroom. I want her to know exactly who's killing her before she dies." Terror froze Catherine in place. These were the men who had murdered Thomas. They'd returned to silence her. She backed toward the window, but before she could escape, the bedroom door crashed open. A bearded man with a scar across his cheek stood in the doorway, a malicious grin spreading across his face when he spotted her. "Well, hello there, widow woman. Remember me?" He raised his pistol. "Your husband sure did, right before I put a bullet in him." Catherine raised Thomas's gun with shaking hands. "Get out of my house," she managed, her voice surprisingly steady. The man laughed. "Feisty, I like that. But that gun ain't gonna help you none. There's three of us and one of a deafening gunshot cut him off mid-sentence." The intruder's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled forward, revealing Mason standing in the hallway behind him, pistol raised. "Run, Catherine," Mason shouted, firing again as a second man appeared from the front room. Catherine scrambled through her bedroom window, landing painfully in the dirt outside. She could hear more gunfire from within the house, the terrible sounds of a life or death struggle. Clutching Thomas's revolver, she circled toward the front of the house, determined not to leave Mason to face the intruders alone. As she reached the corner, a third man burst through her front door, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He spotted Catherine and raised his gun, but she fired first. Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, insisting she know how to protect herself. The outlaw fell, clutching his shoulder. More shots rang out from inside the house. Catherine approached the fallen man cautiously, keeping her gun trained on him. "Don't move," she warned, her voice shaking now with adrenaline. Moments later, Mason appeared in the doorway, blood soaking his left sleeve. "Catherine," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, eyes fixed on his injury. "You're bleeding. Just a graze. The two inside won't be bothering anyone ever again." Mason knelt beside the wounded outlaw, roughly binding the man's hands with his own belt. "This one's still breathing. Sheriff Wilson will want to question him." By noon, the sheriff and his deputies had removed the bodies and taken the surviving outlaw into custody. Dr. Peterson had cleaned and bandaged Mason's wound, assuring Catherine it wasn't serious. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, gathered at the edge of her property, their expressions a mix of horror and morbid curiosity. "You're lucky Mr. James was here," Sheriff Wilson told Catherine as they stood on her blood-stained porch. "From what the survivor confessed, these were the same men who killed your husband. They came back to make sure you couldn't identify them." He glanced at Mason with newfound respect. "Where'd you learn to handle yourself like that, son?" "Spent some time as a deputy in Colorado Territory," Mason replied quietly. "Didn't mention it before as it didn't seem relevant." The sheriff raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, Mrs. Keller, your home isn't fit for staying in tonight. We need to clean up this mess properly. You're welcome to room above the jail if you need a place." "She'll stay with me," Mason interjected, then quickly amended, "at my uncle's cabin. It's rough but sound. Mrs. Keller can have the cabin and I'll sleep outside until her place is habitable again." Catherine, still dazed from the morning's violence, nodded mutely. The thought of staying in her home, where Thomas had died and now two more men lay dead, was unbearable. By late afternoon, Catherine found herself at Samuel James's cabin, a simple one-room structure nestled in a small clearing. It was dusty and neglected, but, as Mason had said, structurally sound. While Mason fetched water from the well, Catherine swept the wooden floors and aired out the musty bedding. "It's not much," Mason apologized, setting down a bucket of fresh water, "but it's secure. No one will look for you here tonight." "Thank you," Catherine said softly, "for everything. If you hadn't been there this morning—" She couldn't finish the thought. "But I was," Mason said simply, "and now those men can't hurt anyone else." As darkness fell, Mason built a fire outside the cabin where he intended to sleep. Catherine watched from the doorway as he tended the flames, his movements careful to avoid straining his injured arm. "You should take the bed," she called. "With your wound, you shouldn't be sleeping on the ground." Mason shook his head. "Wouldn't be proper. Nor is it proper for me to be here at all," Catherine pointed out. "Yet circumstances have made it necessary. At least come inside where it's warmer. The cabin floor is better than the cold ground." After some further protest, Mason relented. He spread his bedroll in the corner furthest from the small bed, positioning himself between Catherine and the door, a protective gesture that didn't escape her notice. In the dim light of the single oil lamp, Catherine studied his profile as he checked his pistol before setting it within easy reach. "You never said you were a lawman," she observed. "Former lawman," Mason corrected. "Wasn't something I planned to do long-term." "Why did you leave?" Mason was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. "Had to kill a man," he said finally. "A boy, really. Couldn't have been more than 16. Caught him rustling cattle and he drew on me." His voice was hollow with old regret. "After that, the badge felt too heavy." Catherine moved to sit beside him, drawn by the pain in his voice. "You did what you had to do, maybe. But there are some choices that stay with you." Mason looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past her widow's black to the woman beneath. "Like your choice to stay here after your husband died. That took courage, or foolishness," Catherine whispered. "If I had sold and left, as the sheriff suggested, those men wouldn't have come back. And they might have hurt someone else instead." Mason's hand found hers in the dimness, a brief, comforting touch. "You survived, Catherine, that's what matters." That night, despite her exhaustion, Catherine lay awake listening to Mason's steady breathing across the room. His presence brought a sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Yet it was more than that. In the quiet darkness, she admitted to herself that Mason James had become important to her, not just as a protector, but as a man. The realization brought a wave of guilt. Thomas had been dead barely a month. How could she already be developing feelings for someone else? What kind of widow did that make her? Catherine turned her face into the pillow, tears flowing silently as she mourned not only her husband, but also the certainties that had shaped her world. Dawn brought clarity with its golden light. Catherine rose before Mason woke, slipping outside to wash her face in the cool well water. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding trees. In the distance, she could see her own homestead, smoke rising from the chimney as the sheriff's men continued their work. Mason emerged from the cabin, his hair tousled from sleep. "How are you feeling?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "Alive," Catherine answered honestly, "which is more than I expected yesterday morning." They shared a simple breakfast of hard tack and dried apples from Mason's saddlebag. As they ate, Catherine made her decision. "Your proposal," she began carefully, "about working together, I've been thinking about it." Mason set down his tin cup. "And I think it makes sense," Catherine said. "Practical sense, at least. I can't manage alone and you need guidance with farming." "But people will talk." "Let them," Mason replied with a slight shrug. "We'll know the truth of it." By mid-morning, Sheriff Wilson rode out to inform them that Catherine's home had been cleaned and repaired as best as possible. "Those men won't be bothering you again," he assured her. The survivor confessed they were indeed the same gang that killed your husband. He'll hang for his crimes. Catherine nodded, finding no satisfaction in the news, only a hollow sense that justice, however swift, couldn't bring Thomas back. As they rode back to her homestead, Catherine felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. The house looked the same from the outside, but she knew it would feel different now. More blood had been spilled under its roof. Mason seemed to sense her apprehension. "I can stay a few more nights in your barn," he offered, "just until you feel safe again." Catherine paused at her front gate. "No," she said firmly. "If we're to be business partners, we should do this properly. I'll speak with Pastor Miller about drawing up an agreement. You'll build proper quarters for yourself here, not in the barn, and we'll work both properties together." Mason studied her face, searching for certainty. "If that's what you want." "It's what I need," Catherine clarified, "to survive. To keep Thomas's dream alive, even if he can't be part of it anymore." The arrangement raised eyebrows in Fort Smith, as expected. Some townspeople whispered behind Catherine's back, questioning her morals for allowing a single man to live on her property so soon after her husband's death. Others, like the kindly Mrs. Peterson, defended her practical decision. What would they have her do? Catherine overheard Mrs. Peterson challenging the gossips at the general store one afternoon. Starve for the sake of appearances. The woman lost her husband to murderers, for heaven's sake. She needs protection, and Mr. James saved her life. Despite the gossip, Catherine and Mason settled into a productive routine. Mason built a small cabin for himself about 50 yards from the main house, close enough to provide protection, but far enough to maintain propriety. They divided labor according to their strengths. Catherine managed planting and harvesting decisions, while Mason handled the physically demanding work and cared for their growing herd of horses. As summer faded into autumn, Catherine found herself watching Mason more often than she should. She noticed the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt as he chopped wood, how his eyes crinkled at the corners on the rare occasions he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he tended to an injured foal. Guilt still plagued her for these observations, but it had begun to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that life continued even after devastating loss. One crisp October evening, as they sat on Catherine's porch reviewing the season's profits, Mason cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Got a letter today," he said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "From an old friend in Colorado, says they need experienced hands for a cattle drive next spring. Good money." Catherine felt her heart constrict. "Are you thinking of going?" Mason studied the distant horizon. "Crossed my mind. Winter's coming and there won't be much to do here once the ground freezes." He glanced at her. "Would make sense to earn extra money for spring planting." Catherine nodded, unable to voice her sudden fear that if Mason left, he might not return. "Of course, that's practical." "I'd be back by March," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "In time for planting. You don't need my permission, Mason. Our arrangement was never meant to be permanent." Catherine kept her voice even though inside something was breaking open. Mason turned to face her fully. "Is that what you want? For it to be temporary?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Catherine found herself unable to answer, trapped between honesty and propriety. "I should check on the horses before dark," Mason said finally, rising from his chair. He paused, one hand resting on the porch railing. "For what it's worth, Catherine, I'm not eager to leave, but I don't want to stay where I'm not wanted either." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Catherine with the uncomfortable realization that she needed to decide what and whom she truly wanted in her life. That night, Catherine took out the small music box Thomas had made for her, winding the delicate mechanism and listening to its familiar melody. "What would you want for me, Thomas?" she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Would you want me to be alone forever?" The music box offered no answers, only the same sweet tune it had played for years. Catherine closed her eyes, remembering Thomas's smile, his laugh, the way he'd held her on cold nights. Those memories would always be precious to her, but were they meant to be her only future? A week passed with a new awkwardness between her and Mason. He continued his work diligently but spoke less, as if already preparing for his departure. Catherine found herself inventing reasons to seek his company, questions about the horses, concerns about winter preparations, anything to bridge the growing distance between them. The first snow came early that year, dusting Fort Smith with white in mid-November. Catherine woke to find Mason already clearing a path from her door to the barn, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she called, wrapping her shawl tighter as she stepped onto the porch. Mason looked up, a rare smile breaking across his face. "First snow always is." "Won't last, though. Ground's not cold enough yet." "Will you stay for breakfast?" Catherine asked impulsively. "I'm making hot cakes." They ate together in Catherine's kitchen, the warm stove creating a cozy atmosphere against the wintry scene outside. For a while, the tension between them eased, and conversation flowed naturally as it had in earlier days. "I've been thinking about your cattle drive," Catherine said as they finished their meal. "When would you need to leave?" "January, probably, to reach Colorado in time." Mason studied her face. "Unless there's reason for me to stay." Catherine took a deep breath. "I don't want you to go," she admitted finally. "These past months, having you here has meant more than I can say." "But I'm still Thomas's widow, and you feel you're betraying him by caring for someone else," Mason finished gently. Catherine nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Is that foolish?" "No," Mason said. "It's loyal, and I respect that about you, Catherine, always have." He rose from the table, carrying his plate to the wash basin. "I won't press you, but know this: whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice." As winter settled fully over Fort Smith, the days grew shorter and the work less demanding. Catherine found more time for reflection, often sitting by her window watching snowflakes dance in the wind. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd shared, of the dreams cut short by violence. And increasingly, she thought of Mason, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. One evening in early December, Pastor Miller stopped by during his rounds visiting parishioners. As they sat by Catherine's fire drinking tea, the elderly minister broached the subject that had been consuming her thoughts. "Mrs. Peterson tells me Mr. James might be leaving come January," he said, his kind eyes studying Catherine over the rim of his teacup. "He's had an offer of work in Colorado," Catherine confirmed. "It would be foolish to refuse good wages." Pastor Miller nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel about his potential departure?" Catherine hesitated, then decided honesty was best with the man who had counseled her through her darkest days of grief. "Conflicted. I've come to rely on him, not just for help with the farm, but—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the complex emotions Mason stirred in her. "But as a companion," the pastor finished gently. "There's no sin in that, Catherine. The human heart was not designed for perpetual solitude." "Thomas has been gone less than 6 months," Catherine whispered. "How can I even think of caring for another man so soon?" Pastor Miller set down his cup. "My dear, grief has no timetable. Some mourn for years, others find their hearts healing more quickly. Neither path diminishes the love they felt for the one they lost." He reached across to pat her hand. "I knew Thomas well. He loved you deeply and wanted your happiness above all else. Do you truly believe he would want you to deny yourself comfort and companionship out of loyalty to his memory?" The question lingered with Catherine long after the pastor departed. That night, she dreamed of Thomas. In the dream, they walked together through their homestead as it had been in spring, wildflowers dotting the fields. Thomas looked as he had when they first met, young, vibrant, his eyes crinkling with laughter. "You've done well," dreamed Thomas told her, gesturing to the flourishing land around them. "But you're still holding back, Cat." "I miss you," she said simply. "I know, and I miss you." He touched her cheek gently. "But I'm not there anymore, and you are. You deserve to breathe again, Catherine." She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a curious lightness in her heart. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, almost like a visitation. Catherine rose and went to her window. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from Mason's cabin chimney. He was already awake, starting his day as he always did, steadfast and reliable. Catherine dressed quickly and made her way through the fresh snow to his cabin. Her knock was answered almost immediately, Mason appearing in the doorway with surprise written across his features. "Catherine." "Is something wrong?" "No," she said, suddenly uncertain now that she stood before him. "I just—" Needed to speak with you. May I come in? Mason stepped aside, gesturing her into the cabin's warmth. The small space was meticulously neat, with few personal belongings, a reminder that Mason had lived most of his life as a nomad, carrying only what could fit in his saddlebags. I've made a decision, Catherine said, turning to face him, about your leaving. Mason's expression remained carefully neutral. And, I don't want you to go, she stated simply. Not just because I need help with the farm, though I do, but because, Catherine took a deep breath, gathering her courage, because when I'm with you, I can breathe again. After Thomas died, it felt like I was drowning, like there wasn't enough air in the world, but you changed that. Mason remained still, his blue eyes intent on her face. Catherine, please let me finish, she interrupted. I'll always love Thomas. He was my first love, and part of my heart will always belong to him. But I've realized that loving him doesn't mean I can't also care for you. There's room in a heart for more than one love. She stepped closer. If you still want to stay, that is. Mason moved toward her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. I never wanted to leave, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Only thought it might be easier for you if I did. It wouldn't be, Catherine whispered. I can't breathe without him, Mason. But I've learned I can breathe with you instead. Mason reached for her then, his calloused hands gently framing her face. You're sure? Catherine nodded, certainty filling her for the first time in months. I'm sure. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration of new territory. When they parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day I found you in the cemetery, he confessed, but I never thought I'd have the right. It feels right, Catherine said simply. Different from Thomas, but right in its own way. As winter deepened, their relationship blossomed. Mason continued to sleep in his cabin, both of them agreeing that marriage, if it came, should wait until an appropriate period of mourning had passed. But he took his meals with Catherine, and they spent evenings together by her fire, talking or simply enjoying each other's quiet company. The town's gossip eventually subsided as people accepted the practical nature of their partnership. Sheriff Wilson, in particular, became a vocal supporter after Mason helped capture a gang of bank robbers who terrorized neighboring settlements. Good to have a man with experience around, the sheriff commented after the incident. Town could use a deputy if you're interested. Mason glanced at Catherine before answering. Might be come spring, assuming Mrs. Keller can spare me from the fields occasionally. By March, as promised, the snow began to retreat, revealing the dormant earth beneath. Catherine and Mason walked their combined property, planning the spring planting and discussing improvements for the coming year. We could expand the horse breeding, Mason suggested as they stood on a hill overlooking both homesteads. That gelding you raised fetched a good price at auction. Catherine nodded, leaning slightly against his solid presence. Thomas always wanted to raise horses, she said, finding she could speak her late husband's name now without the sharp pain that had once accompanied it. He would approve. Mason's arm encircled her shoulders. I wish I could have known him. He would have liked you, Catherine said with certainty. You're both stubborn as mules. Mason laughed, the sound carrying across the open land. Speaking of stubborn, he said, turning to face her, I've been patient, Catherine Keller. I've respected your mourning period and the memory of your husband, but I think it's time I made my intentions clear. He took her hands in his. I love you. Have since that first day, I suspect, though I fought against it knowing your heart belonged to another man. I'm asking if you might consider making a life with me officially, as my wife. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of grief. I've been waiting for you to ask, she admitted. And yes, Mason James, I will marry you. Not to replace what I lost, but to build something new. They were married on a perfect spring day in May, with wildflowers covering the prairie and the promise of new crops emerging from the soil. Pastor Miller performed the ceremony in the small Fort Smith church, with the townspeople who had once gossiped now offering their blessings to the unlikely couple. Do you regret waiting? Mason asked that night as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the stars emerge overhead. Catherine shook her head, leaning into the circle of his arms. No, the waiting was necessary. It gave me time to learn that loving you doesn't diminish what Thomas and I shared. It honors it in a way. He taught me how to love, and that love didn't die with him. She turned in Mason's embrace to face him, but I'm glad the waiting is over. As am I, Mason murmured, lowering his lips to hers. In the years that followed, their homestead flourished. Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, who inherited her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Their horse breeding business became known throughout the territory for quality stock. Mason eventually accepted the sheriff's offer and served as deputy 3 days a week, using his experience to help maintain peace in the growing town. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Mason presented Catherine with a small wooden box. She opened it to find a delicate music box, carved with prairie wildflowers and horses. When wound, it played a sweet melody that brought tears to her eyes. "I know it can't replace the one Thomas made," Mason said quietly, "but I wanted you to have something that represents our story too." Catherine held the beautiful creation in her hands, deeply moved by her husband's thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she whispered, "a reminder that life can give second chances when we're brave enough to take them." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching 4-year-old Grace chase fireflies across the yard, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had survived unimaginable loss, faced down killers, and ultimately found the courage to open her heart again. The pain of Thomas's death would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, noting her contemplative expression. Catherine smiled, reaching for his hand. "About breathing," she said simply. "And how I couldn't imagine doing it without Thomas until I learned to breathe with you instead." Mason squeezed her hand, understanding in his eyes. "I'm grateful every day that you did." As darkness settled over their homestead, Catherine Keller James looked out at the land she and Mason had nurtured together, land that held memories of two loves, both precious in their own way. The future stretched before them, unknown but full of promise. And with each breath she took beside the man who had helped her find joy again, Catherine gave thanks for the resilience of the human heart and its remarkable capacity to heal, to hope, and to love once more.